Okay, we're going to revise Theme 1, Chapter 1 of the OIB History Programme. That's the Wall Street crash and its impact. Now, I think in studying the slide to war, as you did at the start of the year with your Histoire Géo teachers, you'll have been confronted by a really complex issue. So I hope this PowerPoint and the commentary I'm doing with it is going to supplement the notes you've already got and help you to draw out some links between the different factors that converged in the 1930s to create a world crisis. And there's three things in particular that I'm going to be looking at. First of all, the crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, which is simultaneously a crisis of democracy. So we'll be looking at how the Wall Street crash developed into a worldwide economic depression and then thinking about its impact on international relations. Secondly, we'll be looking at economic nationalism, how this influenced the march of militarism in our three aggressive states, that's fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. And then finally, we'll be exploring why the democratic powers, that's Britain and France and the United States, proved so unwilling to defend the liberal order that they themselves had created at Versailles. So if you master all of that, you should do pretty well with these types of questions. I've given you a sort of typical OIB format for the sorts of questions that one could ask about Theme 1, Chapter 1. So you've got the 8-mark questions with the explain command word, and then you've got the 12-mark questions with the how far do you agree command, which is requiring you, as you know, to do an argument, a counter-argument, and arrive at a nuanced analysis. Now, in order to answer those questions, we've got to start somewhere, haven't we? And I thought the best place to begin was with the big picture of the 1914-1945 period as a whole. That's 31 years of history framed at either end by the two most devastating conflicts in all of human history. That's World War I and World War II. And I've put some statistics about World War I up here on the slide to illustrate just how nihilistic this era of total war really was. As you can see, 16.5 million deaths in World War I, 21 million wounded. Total cost was $196 billion using the 1990 value of the dollar. And I've also given you some statistics on France here as well. You know, the fact that France lost 20% of men of military age as a cause to World War I. 10 départements of France from the Pas-de-Calais on the Channel coast right across to the Alps are devastated by the fighting. And I've given you these because I think they are so significant. They're so crucial to the story of the 1930s, and in particular, giving us a context as to why France chose the path of appeasement. So we've got an astonishing level of devastation in World War I, and then this experience is repeated again one generation later in World War II. And as you can see, it's a level of generation that dwarfs even that that total war created in 1914, 1918. And the statistics tell their own story, don't they? $2 trillion is using the 1990 value of the dollar is what World War II cost. 78 million deaths. And in Germany alone, 8 million houses destroyed. So those are the two key events at either end of our time frame. And in the middle, or rather right at the end of World War I, we've got the Versailles Treaty, presided over by Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Britain. And Woodrow Wilson, arrives in France with this messianic vision that he and he alone is the man who will create a new world order, to make World War I the war to end all wars, to make the world safe for democracy. So, when we're studying the causes of World War II, we are simultaneously studying the abject failure of this first attempt to create a liberal democratic world order. Now, as I say this, I'm aware it's very, very easy to go down the path of simply arguing that the Treaty of Versailles led to World War II. Now, it's true, there are clear problems with the Treaty of Versailles. The issue of German reparations, and with it, Article 231 of the treaty that required that total blame for the causes of World War I be attached to Germany. Now that in effect shackles the Weimar Republic to all of the injustices of the Versailles Treaty, and that's something that the Nazis, as well you know, will ruthlessly exploit throughout the late 1920s and into the 1930s. But there was a lot of politics played out between 1918 and 1939, so it's far too simplistic to lay all the blame on the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. If we're looking for why Wilson's vision of a new world order, an order where the world was made safe for democracy, failed, we've got to look for other factors. And one of the underlying causes of World War II was a legacy of World War I itself. Now this, as you know from Premiere, was a total war. So to put it simply, total war was the act by the state of harnessing all the resources of the country, its labour, its technology, its industry, its capital reserves, in order to feed the military machine. Now what this amounts to is an unprecedented concentration of economic and political power in the hands of the state. State power demanding total obedience and total identification of each individual with its aims was, as you know, on the march in the interwar years. And this model of totalitarianism had in effect been created and developed during the experience of total war in World War I. You've got some great quotes on this that you could use in an essay or in an oral. The first one from Hobsbawm, talking about the fact that the experience of World War I itself helped to brutalise both warfare and politics. And by that, he's thinking about the post-war politics and post-war warfare, for that matter, the politics of totalitarianism. If one could be conducted without counting the human or any costs, why not the other? And then you've got another good quote from the French writer Georges Bernanos, saying that each nation state carried within its belly the embryo of totalitarianism. But there's another legacy of World War I, and that, as you can see from the bin, is the astonishing power vacuum created across Europe by the collapse of all those ancient dynasties which have been smashed apart by total war. You can see the list is there. 4 empires collapsed: the Kaiserreich, the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Those empires and the heads of state, the crown princes and emperors, all end up in the dustbin in the aftermath of World War I. What's happened here is that the imperial framework that had been an integral part of Europe's history, and therefore it was really through empires and imperial dynasties that Europe conducted its politics for well over 1,000 years, that had gone. You probably have to go back to the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West for a time when European history had not been dominated by empire. And what you can see here from the maps, if you look at the map of Europe in 1900, before World War I, those great blocks, the Russian Empire in yellow, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in red, the Ottoman Empire in brown, by 1922, they've now been replaced by a whole patchwork of small nation states, many of whom had become democracies. This was absolutely part of Wilson's vision of a new world order in 1919, that idea of a world that had been democratized and was safe for democracy. Now, in theory, this sounds wonderful, but if you can see the quote at the bottom, it's from a historian called Professor Margaret Macmillan, as she tells us, what happens in the aftermath of World War II is that a world that is created that is scarred by dislocation and turmoil. As she says, the peacemakers were dealing with factors way beyond their control. How on earth do you deal with ethnic nationalism? Now, in terms of our story, I think you're looking at a legacy of World War I that creates a chronic instability across Europe right throughout the interwar years. Now we can sense this underlying instability across Europe when we look at what happened to the successor states, the nation states that emerged out of the collapse of empire, these new democracies that have been created by the peace treaties. And there's a quote here from Mark Mazo. You've all got the Mazo book. It's a brilliant book, well worth reading. And he states that, liberal democracy's triumph was short-lived. Fear of communism, created by the Russian Revolution, created a political climate, essentially, in which there was authoritarian regimes will prosper. And as Mazo says, democratic values simply disappeared in the interwar years. It starts with Hungary in 1919. Democracy collapses. Democracy collapses in Italy in 1922. It collapses in Spain in 1923. In Portugal in 1926. And then on into the 1930s. And we see with the onset of the Great Depression and economic nationalism, democracies fall again like a house of cards right across Europe. So you can see, and if we look at what writers thought about what was going on in Europe, you can see there's a real sense of pessimism. 1925, Moritz Bonn writes The Crisis of European Democracy. Democracy on Trial, I think that was 1932. After Democracy, H.G. Wells, 1932. Mazower puts the whole thing rather succinctly in red, as you can see. This attempt to create democracy, something that we think is completely and utterly a natural, integral feature of the European landscape, was nothing more than an experiment. And he calls it a novelty. It hadn't happened before. It was an untried experiment. It's one that failed. And as he says, democracy looked triumphant in 1918, but it was virtually extinct 20 years on. So let's sum up what we know so far about the legacies of World War I and how they will impact on the interwar years. We know that World War I brought about that astonishing collapse of ancient dynasties, ancient empires on the European continent. We know that the small successor states began life with democratic systems, but they failed. The fear of communist parties within those nation states was often a reason for the transition from democracy to authoritarianism. So there was a profound instability to Europe in the interwar years. At no stage could the world be described as being safe for democracy. Now, instability is one thing, but world crisis and war, total war, is another thing entirely. So in order to understand how and why these instabilities, these underlying instabilities, helped to lead to World War II, we need to find the catalyst of world crisis. And we'll do that on the next Screencast-O-Matic because I'm running out of time and space here.